You think you know horror? You think you've heard the darkest stories America has to offer? You haven't. You've heard the sanitized packaged tales, the ones with easy answers. But today, we're going somewhere else. We're going deep into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, to a time when the law was just a rumor, and the forests held secrets that could, and did, eat people alive. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. We're diving into the case of the Whitlock sisters. 3 names history tried to forget. 3 identical faces that haunt the fog of Pike County, Kentucky, to this very day. So lock your doors, turn up the volume, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because by the time this is over, you'll be glad you're not in the mountains. Our story starts in 1873. The Civil War had just ripped the country in half, and the wounds were still leaking. The South was a broken, angry place. And in the high, lonely hollers of Kentucky and West Virginia, there was no law. There was just the mountain, the fog, and the families who'd been hiding there for generations. These mountains have always had a reputation. They're old. Ancient settlers talked of trails that would just vanish, travelers who'd walk into a patch of fog and never walk out, strange whistling sounds in the pines when the wind was still, but nothing could prepare the world for what was festering on a small, ruined farm near the West Virginia border, the Whitlock family. They were mountain people, tough as oak, and just as twisted. The father, Jonathan Whitlock, had marched off to war and come back with one less arm and a soul full of poison. He was a mean, bitter drunk. The mother, Sarah, had died giving birth to the triplets back in 1852. She left behind 3 identical baby girls, Martha, Clara, and June. And maybe, just maybe, she was the lucky one. 21 years later, those girls were something else. Growing up without a mother in that place was hard. Growing up with Jonathan Whitlock was a living hell. Their nearest neighbors were 3 miles of rocks and rattlesnakes away. No school, no church, nothing but the cliffs and the wind, and a father who only knew rage. The girls grew up like wolves. They learned to hunt, to trap, to move through the woods without a sound. They learned to be silent. They learned not to cry. And they learned something dark. They learned that in those mountains, far from any badge or judge, a person could do anything and get away with it. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in the spring of '73. A traveling merchant, Elias Turner, was making his rounds. These guys were the lifeblood of the high country folks, bringing cloth, tools, news, and medicine. Elias was a good man, known in the region for years. A kind, middle-aged father of 4. He was on his way home to Prestonburg. His last stop, he told the family before the Whitlocks, was the old Whitlock place. Elias Turner never made it home. His wife, God bless her, waited a week of staring at the road, a week of dread coiling in her stomach. Finally, she went to the sheriff in Floyd County. A search was organized. But searching for a man in the Appalachians is like looking for one specific grain of sand on a beach the size of a state. The woods swallow things. Ravines, caves, dense thickets. A man could be 10 feet off the trail and be lost forever. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn was a hard man, a war veteran who knew how to track. He followed Elias's route, farm by farm. The last confirmed sighting was just 10 miles from the Whitlock property. He was heading up there, the farmer told him, said it was his last stop. So Blackburn and 3 deputies rode up that treacherous trail. It was a rainy, miserable June afternoon. The fog was so thick it felt like they were riding into the clouds. They found Jonathan on the porch, drunk at 3 in the afternoon. The air around the cabin was heavy, not just with rain, but with something smell like an old butcher shop. Jonathan, slurring his words, denied everything. Ain't seen no merchant. Nobody's been by here in weeks. And that's when they appeared, the 3 sisters, Martha, Clara, and June. They came to the doorway and just stood there, watching. Blackburn was a man who'd seen battle, who'd seen men torn apart. He'd never felt a shiver like this. They were identical. 21 years old, but with eyes that looked ancient and empty. They wore tattered dresses, caked in mud. Their long, dark hair was matted. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared, cold as creek stones. There was something primal about them, something that wasn't human. Blackburn asked to search the property. Jonathan, in a drunken rage, grabbed his rifle. "You got no warrant," he spat. And technically, he was right. In the post-war South, you didn't just barge onto a man's land, not without concrete proof. Blackburn had nothing. He and his men had to leave. They rode back down the mountain, the mud sucking at their horses' hooves. But as he left, Blackburn looked back. The 3 sisters were still in the doorway, perfectly still, watching him go. He knew, right then, in his gut, he'd been standing in the presence of an evil he couldn't even name, and he knew he'd be back. Wave 2. Blackburn was a good sheriff, but he was a man of the law. He couldn't just storm a man's property on a feeling he needed evidence. He needed a body, but the mountains weren't giving one up. The case of Elias Turner went cold. Just another traveler lost to the wilderness. The whispers in town blamed everything from mountain lions to vengeful spirits of the war. But Sheriff Blackburn, he kept thinking about those eyes, those 3 pairs of identical, empty eyes. He didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks later, another one. This time, it was Reverend Isaiah Morton, an old, frail preacher who traveled alone on foot, bringing the word of God to the most isolated farms. He was a man who believed he could save anyone. He depended on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. And just like Elias Turner, his known route took him right past the high country trails, right toward the Whitlock land. He was last seen heading up the ridge, telling a farmer he was going to try and bring comfort to those poor lost girls at the Whitlock place. The Reverend never came down. Now, losing a merchant is bad for business. Losing a preacher, that's an attack on God himself. The alarm was sounded. Churches from 3 counties organized search parties. We're talking posses of 20, 30 men. Hard, mountain-raised men who knew every trail and holler. They searched for days. They scoured ravines. They lit torches and explored caves. They followed every deer track and water run. Nothing. The Reverend Isaiah Morton had vanished, as if the mountain had just opened up and swallowed him. Sheriff Blackburn was done playing games. The panic was real now. He went to the county judge, a man who'd heard the terrified stories from the search parties. This time, Blackburn got his warrant. He rode back up that mountain, not with 3 deputies, but with 5, and they were all armed for war. They found Jonathan on the porch just like before, drunk, furious. "This is persecution," he yelled. "I'm a war veteran. This is my land." He screamed about his rights, about the government, about his sacrifice. But this time, Blackburn just pushed him aside. "The law's the law, Jonathan. We're searching the place." The search was brutal. It lasted for hours. The cabin was a 3-room shack, barely standing. There was no basement. The men ripped up floorboards. They checked the attic. Nothing. They moved to the barn. It was full of rusty tools, old hay, and the smell of rot. They turned over every bale. They stuck pitchforks into the ground, looking for freshly turned earth. And the whole time, the three sisters sat on the porch, rocking. They sat in a line on an old bench, Martha, Clara, and June, and they rocked, back and forth, in perfect, unnatural, silent unison. When one's head tilted, the other two tilted at the exact same second. When one's eyes blinked, they all blinked. It was so wrong that the deputies started to avoid looking at them. It was like watching a single mind in three bodies. They found nothing, absolutely nothing. No sign of the merchant, no sign of the preacher, not a button, not a boot, not a drop of blood. Blackburn had to admit defeat. He had his warrant, he'd done his search, and he'd come up empty. He and his men mounted up. As they rode away, Blackburn felt like a fool. But he also felt something else. That same chill. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just missed the evidence. He had the horrifying suspicion that the evidence had been watching him. He looked back, just like before. The three sisters were still rocking, in unison, and in the dim, foggy light, he could have sworn they were smiling. Wave 3. The summer of 1873 was a season of terror. After Blackburn's second failed search, it was like the mountain relaxed. Like the evil on that property knew it was untouchable. And the disappearances they sped up 3 more people. Gone. First, a young fur trapper named William Hayes. Just 19. He was new to the area, told everyone he was going to make his fortune in the high ridges. His traps were found, sprung and empty, on a trail that led, you guessed it, right past the Whitlock land. Then, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, a rural doctor who traveled between farms, a good man. He was seen riding his horse up the valley. His horse was found a week later, 20 miles away, thin and panicked. His medical bag was found in a creek, but the doctor was gone. And then, the one that broke the region's heart. A woman, Rebecca Stone. She was running away from an arranged marriage, trying to get to family in Tennessee. She was smart, she was tough, but she didn't know the mountains. She was last seen asking for directions, and someone pointed her up the trail toward the Valley of Death. That's what they called it now. The newspapers in Pikeville and Lexington had picked up the story. They weren't just missing persons anymore. This was a legend. They called it the Valley of Death. They wrote stories about vengeful ghosts, about Cherokee curses, about creatures that lived in the caves. The Appalachian Mountains had always had their stories, but now, it seemed, the stories were coming true. Sheriff Blackburn was a broken man. His reputation was in tatters. He was a lawman who couldn't enforce the law. He'd tracked outlaws, he'd survived a war, but he was being beaten by what? A drunk with 1 arm and 3 silent, creepy girls? It didn't make sense. There were no bodies, no witnesses, no evidence. Just people who walked into the fog and never walked out. So in August, Blackburn made a decision. A desperate one, and a barely legal one. He couldn't get another warrant. He had no new proof. So he decided to watch. He recruited a group of men he trusted, hard, quiet men who'd served with him in the war, and they set up a discreet, 24/7 surveillance on the Whitlock estate. They camped in the trees, on the trails, hidden in the brush. They watched every path in and out. It was a miserable, risky operation. If Jonathan found them, there would be a gunfight, but Blackburn felt he had no other choice. For 2 long, cold weeks, nothing. The men watched. Jonathan went to town once, came back drunk. The sisters, they were ghosts. They would emerge from the cabin together to get water from the stream. They'd disappear into the woods to hunt and return, hours later, together. their hands and dresses stained, but with no game in sight. The men watching them swore they didn't make a sound. They didn't snap a twig. They didn't whisper. They moved like smoke. One deputy, a young man named Parker, swore he saw one of them catch a bird out of the air with her bare hands, and he couldn't be sure, but he thought he saw her eat it. Raw, he told Blackburn. The sheriff just told him to keep watching. Then, one afternoon in early September, everything changed. A new man appeared on the main trail, a lone traveler. He was well dressed for the region, riding a strong bay horse. He looked like he had money. His saddlebags were full. He had a brand new rifle strapped to his saddle. The watchman, hidden in the trees, saw him stop at the bottom of the trail. They saw him look at his map, and they saw him turn his horse and head up the path, right toward the Whitlock cabin. The men couldn't move. They couldn't warn him. To do so would be to reveal their position, to blow the whole operation. They had to just sit and watch. They watched him ride up that steep, muddy path until the trees and the fog swallowed him whole. They waited. 1 hour. The woods were dead silent. 2 hours. The sun started to dip, painting the clouds a sickly, bloody red, and that's when they heard it. A sound, a terrible, high-pitched screaming. It wasn't human. It was the sound of pure animal terror. A moment later, the horse exploded from the woods. It came barreling down the trail, alone. Its eyes were white, foam flying from its mouth. The saddle was empty. The saddlebags were gone. The reins were broken. The animal was panicked, screaming and kicking as if the devil himself was on its tail. The watchman managed to catch the horse. Blackburn, who was at the forward camp, saw it. He looked at the terrified animal. He looked at the empty saddle. And he looked up the mountain, where the sun was now gone, and the shadows were turning black. He drew his rifle. "That's it," he said, his voice quiet and cold as iron. "He's not getting away. We go in. We go in now." Wave 4. This time there was no warrant. This time there was no knocking. This was not a search. This was a raid. Blackburn didn't just bring his deputies. He brought all 12 men from the stakeout. 12 heavily armed, war-hardened men moving up the mountain in tactical formation. They moved through the twilight, the forest darkening around them, the air growing colder. As they got closer to the cabin, a strange silence fell over the woods. No crickets, no birds, just the sound of their own boots in the mud and the pounding of their hearts. They broke through the tree line and saw the cabin. It was dark. No, worse than dark. It looked dead. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, just a black, silent shape against the blood-red sky. That same smell was in the air. Old blood, rot, and something else. Something that smelled like burnt hair. Blackburn held up a fist. The men fanned out, surrounding the cabin. "Jonathan Whitlock!" Blackburn yelled, his voice cracking the silence. "This is Sheriff Blackburn. Come out with your hands in the air." Nothing, not a sound. The cabin was a tomb. "I'm not asking again," he yelled. Still nothing, just the wind, which had suddenly picked up, whistling through the pines. It sounded like it was laughing. "Walsh!" Blackburn motioned to his biggest deputy. "Take the door." Walsh didn't bother with the knob. He just lowered his shoulder and hit the door with all his weight. It exploded inwards, the rotten wood splintering. The men piled in, rifles up, fanning out, expecting gunfire, expecting anything. What they found was nothing. The main room was empty and cold, freezing. The fireplace was full of dead, gray ash. A half-finished bottle of whiskey sat on the table, and in the chair sat Jonathan Whitlock. He was just sitting there, one arm on the table. His eyes were wide open, staring, glazed. He had a look on his face, a look of such absolute mind-shattering terror that two of the deputies had to look away. Blackburn reached out and touched his neck. Cold, stone cold. He'd been dead for hours. There were no marks on him, no wounds, no sign of a struggle. He'd just died, sitting there, staring at something. "Sheriff," a deputy whispered from the back room. His voice was shaking. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Blackburn and the other men moved toward the door of the small shared bedroom. The air coming from it was thick, and there was a sound, a low, rhythmic humming, not a song, more like chanting. Blackburn raised his lantern. The three sisters were there, sitting on the floor, in a tight circle, holding hands. They were rocking back and forth, in unison, and they were humming, a low, guttural, insect-like sound that made the hair on Blackburn's arms stand on end. They were all wearing the same tattered, mud-stained dresses. Their eyes were closed. They were completely, terrifyingly, lost in their trance. "Martha Clara June," Blackburn said, his voice hoarse. "It's over." They didn't stop. The humming just got louder. It seemed to vibrate in the very wood of the cabin. "I said, it's over," he yelled. "Your father's dead." And that's when they stopped. Instantly, the silence was so sudden, it was like a punch to the gut. In unison, all three opened their eyes. They didn't look at Blackburn. They didn't look at the armed men filling their room. They all turned their heads in perfect sync and looked right at Deputy Henry Walsh, who was standing by the back wall. And then one of them, impossible to say which, smiled. "Sheriff," Walsh said, his voice trembling, but his eyes fixed on the floorboards he was standing on. I think you need to look here. The smell." Blackburn moved his lantern. Walsh was standing on a patch of floor that was covered with old straw and rotten planks. But it wasn't the floor. It was a lid. There was a trap door. A door no one had seen in the last two searches because it had been perfectly hidden. A door that led down. Wave 5. That smell. The one Blackburn had smelled on his first visit. It was pouring out of the cracks in that trapdoor, a thick, sweet, coppery smell of a slaughterhouse. Get it open!" Blackburn ordered, his voice tight. Two deputies grabbed the metal ring on the door. They heaved. It didn't budge. It was like it was sealed. "Put your backs into it!" The two men set their rifles down, got a better grip, and pulled. The wood groaned, and with a sound like a coffin opening, the trapdoor screeched open. A wave of cold, damp air hit them in the face. The stench was so bad, two of the deputies stumbled out of the cabin, gagging, vomiting into the mud. Blackburn, holding a cloth over his face, pointed his lantern into the hole. It wasn't a basement. It wasn't a cellar. The Appalachians are full of limestone. Caves, sinkholes, passages that go on for miles. The Whitlock cabin hadn't just been built on the mountain. It had been built into it. Below them was a natural cave, a black, gaping hole in the earth. "Henry, you're with me," Blackburn said, grabbing a rope. "Rest of you watch them." He nodded at the sisters, who hadn't moved. They were just watching, their empty, black eyes tracking the men. Blackburn and Walsh lit 2 torches and lowered themselves into the darkness. The cave was about 15 feet deep, with a low ceiling. The walls were wet, limestone, dripping. The ground was cold, compacted earth, and it was full. At first, it just looked like junk piles of stuff. But as Blackburn raised his torch, his blood turned to ice. It wasn't junk. It was a trophy room. There, folded neatly on a rock, was a merchant's coat, a coat with a specific, hand-stitched patch on the elbow. Blackburn had seen that patch on the missing poster for Elias Turner, next to it a pair of boots, worn, scuffed, and with the name W. Hayes William Hayes, the trapper carved into the leather heel, and on a flat slab of rock, laid out like a surgeon's kit, Dr. Samuel Pritchard's medical tools, his scalpels, his saws gleaming in the torchlight. There was a woman's dress, the one belonging to Rebecca Stone, and there, sitting on top of it, like a final sick joke, was a small, worn Bible. Blackburn picked it up. His hands were shaking. He opened the cover. Written in elegant script, property of the Reverend Isaiah Morton. May God guide my steps. It was all here, the belongings of every missing person. The traveler from that afternoon, his rifle and saddlebags were tossed in a corner, already being sorted. They weren't just killing them. They were collecting them. "Sheriff," Walsh whispered, his torch shaking. Where are the bodies?" Blackburn scanned the cave. Walsh was right. There were clothes, tools, bags, trophies, but there were no bodies, no bones, no bloodstains, nothing. It was clean. What did they do with them?" Walsh stammered. Blackburn didn't answer. He was looking at the far wall. The stone was covered in scratches, strange symbols, patterns he didn't recognize, and tally marks, not in groups of 5. Just lines, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, scratched into the rock, stretching back into a part of the cave that was too small to walk into. "We're done here," Blackburn said, his voice dead. "Let's go." They climbed out. Blackburn slammed the trapdoor shut. He turned to the 3 sisters, who were still sitting there, in the exact same position, hands folded in their laps. "Get them on their feet," he ordered. "Chain them." The deputies moved in. The moment one of them touched Martha's shoulder, the song stopped. The 3 sisters, as one, stopped rocking. They stopped breathing. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, in perfect, sickening unison, they tilted their heads and looked up at the deputies. And they smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was a showing of teeth, a predatory, animalistic, joyful baring of fangs. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a lamb. One of them, Clara, lunged. She moved faster than any human should be able to. She bit the deputy who had touched her, sinking her teeth into his arm. The man screamed as she tore a piece of his uniform and the flesh beneath clean off. It took 6 hardened deputies to subdue them. They fought like wild animals, not screaming, not yelling, but hissing and snarling. They kicked, they bit, they clawed. But the men were stronger. They got the chains on them. Even in heavy iron chains, the sisters were terrifying. They stood together, breathing in the same rhythm, their black eyes darting from man to man. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They just watched and waited as the men dragged them out of the cabin. One of the deputies, the one who had been bitten, was staring at his arm, his face pale. "What is it, son?" Blackburn asked. The deputy looked up, his eyes full of a new kind of terror. "Sheriff, when she bit me, she laughed." Blackburn looked back at the 3 sisters standing in the mud, chained, surrounded by armed men, and they looked, for all the world, like they were the ones in control. Wave 6. The nightmare was far from over. It was just changing. Blackburn left 2 men to guard the sisters, who, now chained, had gone completely limp. They just stood in the yard, unmoving, like 3 identical, horrifying dolls. Blackburn took the rest of his men to search the rest of the property. That smell, the smell of burnt hair, was stronger now, coming from behind the barn. At dawn, as the first, sick, gray light of autumn spilled over the mountains, they found it. Behind the barn, hidden by a thicket of thorns, was a clearing, and in the clearing were the bonfires. There weren't just one. There were 3 large circular pits lined with blackened stones. The ground was saturated with old ash, inches deep. It was a system, and in the ash were the bones. They weren't whole bones. You couldn't look and say, that's a man's arm. No. These bones had been processed. They'd been burned at an incredibly high temperature, burned and smashed and ground. One of the deputies found a pestle, a heavy, smooth river stone, stained black and dark red. It was a tool. They had systematically erased their victims. My God, whispered Deputy Walsh, stumbling back. They incinerated them. No, Blackburn said, his voice hollow as he knelt and ran the ash through his fingers. It was gritty. Not just incinerated. He looked at the shattered fragments. They pulled the bodies from the fire, smashed the bones, and then burned them again and again, until there was nothing left but this. It was a level of meticulous industry that chilled him more than the cave. The cave was a trophy room. This was a factory. One deputy vomited. Another started praying, just saying the Lord's Prayer over and over, his voice shaking. This was beyond murder. This was desecration. This was an attempt to remove people from existence, from God's memory. They found fragments, small pieces of skull, shards of ribs, knuckle bones, enough to prove, without a doubt, what had happened, but not enough to identify anyone. Not that it mattered. The cave full of belongings told them who. This told them how. The long trip down the mountain was the quietest, most terrifying journey of their lives. They put the sisters in a requisitioned farm wagon. They chained them separately, Martha in the front, Clara in the middle, June in the back, but it didn't matter. As the wagon bounced and swayed on the treacherous trail, they moved as one. When the wagon hit a bump, all 3 would jolt to the left, at the exact same second. When one turned her head to look at the passing trees, the other 2 turned their heads in the same direction. At the same time, the deputies guarding them rode as far from the wagon as they could. To look at them was to feel seasick. To watch them was to feel like your brain was coming undone. They were 3, but they were one news, even in 1873. Travels fast when it's this big. Messengers had ridden ahead. By the time the wagon rumbled into the main street of Pikeville, the entire town was waiting. It wasn't a crowd. It was a mob. There must have been 200 people. Family of Elias Turner, friends of Reverend Morton, the sister of Rebecca Stone, and dozens of angry, terrified townsfolk who hadn't slept in months. They were screaming, "Witches! Devils! Give 'em to us, Sheriff! Let us burn 'em!" They had torches. They had ropes. Blackburn had to position his 12 deputies, rifles drawn, in a perimeter around the wagon just to get it to the jail. The mob pressed in, spitting, throwing rocks, and through it all the 3 sisters sat unmoved. They didn't flinch. They didn't cry. They just stared. Their faces were pale porcelain masks. The rage, the hatred, the fear of the entire town, it washed over them and didn't touch them. It was like they existed in a completely different world. The Pikeville jail was a small, 2-story building of wood and stone. It had 4 cells. For Blackburn made the most important decision of his life. "Separate them," he ordered. "I want one in cell 1, one in cell 3, one in cell 4. I want walls between them. I want to break that thing they do." The deputies dragged them inside. For the first time since their capture, the sisters reacted. The moment the deputies started pulling Martha toward cell 1 and Clara toward cell 3, the moment they were physically separated, they fought and they screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was a sound, a note, a single, high-pitched, inhuman shriek, and all three of them made the exact same sound, at the exact same time. It wasn't three screams. It was one scream, from three mouths. The sound was so loud, so unnatural. It shattered the glass in the sheriff's office window. It made men with battle experience drop their rifles and cover their ears. It was a sound of tearing. The scream lasted for 30 seconds, and then it stopped, abruptly, as if a switch had been thrown. And the sisters went limp. They didn't fight anymore. The deputies, trembling and pale, dragged each one into her separate cell and slammed the heavy iron doors. The silence that fell was worse than the scream. Each sister in her own cell, unable to see or hear the others, walked to the exact same corner, turned to face the exact same wall, and stood motionless, like statues. They didn't sit. They didn't lie down. They just stood, facing the corner. For hours, the guards who watched them that first night swore they weren't even blinking. Wave 7. That night, the Pikeville jail became the most terrifying place on earth. Sheriff Blackburn left 2 guards on duty, Robert Mills and James Crawford. These were not rookies. These were tough, experienced men. They'd seen it all, or so they thought. The jail was dead silent. The 3 sisters just stood facing their respective corners, in their separate cells. They didn't move for hours. At around 11 p.m., Mills reported hearing whispers. He said it wasn't coming from a cell. It was everywhere, low, rhythmic, sibilant sounds. He walked the corridor, lamp held high. The moment he got near the cells, the whispering stopped. He looked in. Martha, facing the corner. Clara, facing the corner. June, facing the corner, motionless. He went back to his desk. The whispering started again. At 2 a.m., things got worse. Crawford, the other guard, swore he heard arguing. He said it sounded like the sisters, but it wasn't English. It was a harsh, guttural language, and it was coming from all 3 cells at once. He ran to check. The instant his boots hit the corridor, silence. He looked in cell 1. Martha. In the corner. He looked in cell 3. Clara. In the corner. He looked in cell 4. June. In the corner. He was shaking. He told Mills. Mills told him he was hearing things. And then at 3:17 a.m., Crawford screamed. Mills ran back, drawing his gun. He found Crawford pressed against the far wall, his face white, his eyes wide, pointing a trembling finger at cell 3. At Clara. She. Crawford stammered. Mills looked. Clara was standing in the corner. What, man? What is it? She was floating, Crawford whispered, tears in his eyes. I swear to God, Robert, she was 6 inches off the floor, just hovering. And she turned her head all the way around, and she looked at me. And she smiled. Mills looked at Clara. She was standing normally. He looked at Crawford, a man he'd known for 10 years, a man who didn't lie. And, Robert. Crawford stammered. When she smiled, Martha in that cell giggled. At dawn, when Sheriff Blackburn arrived, he found his 2 guards huddled by the stove, refusing to go back into the cell block. They both quit. On the spot. Blackburn didn't even try to stop them. He could feel it. The cold in that building wasn't natural. Meanwhile, the investigation at the cabin was yielding new horrors. Dr. Albert Brennan, the county medical examiner, had gone up to examine Jonathan's body. The man had died on the chair. Brennan's conclusion? Heart failure. Simple, classic heart failure. Probably from his years of alcoholism. But there